So as I said, these are the two things that we include under the heading of predictive analytics or machine learning. Okay, so before we move on, let's just review some things that you already are definitely familiar with. So we look at some terms that we use to describe data. Okay, when we are looking at a data set in this context, in the context of this course, it'll be a table. Okay, so there are some columns, there are some rows, and each row describes an individual case. Okay, so some of the terms that we may be using for the columns, we can use the terms attributes, variables, fields, characteristics, features. All of these are synonyms for referring to columns of a table. Most of the time, I will try to use the term attributes. Sometimes I might use the term variable. These other three terms I probably will not be using. Okay, so most of the time I'll say attribute. Sometimes I might say variable. So that's what a column is. And the rows I would generally refer to as rows, but each row refers to a particular case in the data. So you could call it a case. Sometimes people will also use the term record to refer to an individual row or observation, etc. All of these again are synonyms. Most of the time I'll be using the term row. Okay, now notice here we are talking about household number, etc., etc. So each row here corresponds to one household. So for example, the first household has an income of 60,000, has the lot size of 18,400 square feet, and that household happens to be an owner of whatever it is that we are talking about in this example. In this case, it's the ownership of a riding mower, for example. Okay, so that's what a data set is, and this is the terminology we'll be using. Okay, and the collection of attributes, which is the columns, describes an individual row or a case. Okay, so there are several types of attributes that are typically used, and broadly speaking, you can talk of an attribute as being a quantitative attribute, which has got a numerical value, or a qualitative attribute. Okay, so for example, gender. It's not a quantitative number, right? It's male, female. Or you may have color, red, blue, yellow, green. Again, that's not a number. That's just a category. Okay, so those are qualitative attributes, whereas you may have quantitative attributes like age and salary and GPA, etc. These are all numbers. Now, within qualitative categories, you could have them to be nominal, which means that the category is just a name. So for example, you may have a particular attribute which is nominal, which is categorical, and the values may simply be gender, for example, male or female, or it could be colors, red, blue, green, yellow, orange, etc. So in these cases, there is no comparative value between the individual values of the attribute. So for example, you've got an attribute called gender, and a person may be a male or a female. There's nothing to say that one is bigger or smaller than the other. They are just two equal categories. That's it. Similarly, you may have an attribute which is a color. So you've got red, blue, yellow, green, white, etc. There is nothing to say one is bigger than the other. These are just names. Okay, so that is why those kinds of attributes are called nominal attributes. Most of the time when we are dealing with qualitative data or categorical data, you would be using them, treating them as nominal. Sometimes your categorical attributes actually have an underlying order to them. So for example, I gave an example earlier where we said the salary can be low, medium, or high. Okay, so low, medium, and high are not numbers. They are just categories, three categories. But we know that low is smaller than medium, which is smaller than high. So there is an order. But those values don't have a precise numerical value. Okay, it's just an ordered category, and that is what is called as an ordinal value. When it comes to quantitative variables or quantitative attributes, we'll be talking about just a number, right? So I won't go into the difference between interval and ratio. Ratio basically means that all arithmetic operations are meaningful for those values. So for example, you've got two values, you can add, subtract, multiply, divide. Everything is allowed. So for example, salaries, right? So you can take two salaries and then you can you can find out that you can find the difference between two salaries. You can add two salaries. You can find out, you can divide one salary by other and say that this salary is three times that salary. So all of those operations are meaningful, and that is what we would generally be looking at when we are looking at quantitative variables. Now you might recall from your earlier courses that in R, we call qualitative variables or categorical variables as factors, right? So that's what we call those variables in R as factors. Okay, so I'll be using the term factor as well. An ordinal variable is basically called as an ordered factor in R. You already know from an earlier course that we refer to a data set when it is stored inside R as a data frame. Okay, so a data frame is a single variable which holds the complete data set. Okay, and you have spent a lot of time working with data frames, so I don't need to go into any further details. Okay, so that completes our first lesson of the first unit. Now, as always, at the end of this, there are some review questions. So it'll be a good idea for you to go look at the review questions, answer them, check your answers before moving on to the next lesson.